having just talked about the Quran itself, let's stay with the Quran. You want to stay because there is some no, there's some other things we need to look at, Mel. And this is something that you're saying is rather speculative. You're not going to put your foot down and say this is exactly what it means, like we could with the name Muhammad itself. You're saying that there are some other inferences to Jesus in the Quran that are very that have antecedents in the Old Testament. And the name you're going to bring up, I think, is angel of God. So I want to see what you
Yeah,
do with this. I'm not sure I can agree with you. You're not even sure that this
yeah,
could be, but you're putting it out as what we call a white paper. And for those of you who understand what we
exactly.
mean, whenever we put a white paper, these are what if. These are possibilities. This is where we're at in 2024. It may change as we find new material, but we need to put it out there because it is important that you all hear it and then you come back to us with it and let's have a discussion on it. So over to you, Mel. What is this angel of God that you're referring to?
Yeah. So in the Old Testament, there's a concept called theophanies, which is appearances of God. And one of the big ones in the Old Testament is the angel of God. Now, to to some people, they might see the word angel and think, well, angel God just means an angel. But if we look at the Old Testament in context, it's really clear there's actually another way of saying God. Now, what we'll see is that if we compare that phrase, angel of God, with a phrase that you see commonly in the Quran, it seems to suggest that machmad or Muhammad is the angel of God. So I'm going to share the slides with you now just to introduce it further. So we're going to look at the concept of Muhammad, messenger of Allah, originally meant Jesus is the angel of the Lord, which this is, as I say, it's a bit of a hunch. It's just following a few logical inferences here. And it's, as Jay has said, it's a kind of like a white paper. So I'm going to suggest that messenger of Allah is actually a later interpretation, meaning prophet of God. The Hebrew word Malak can be translated as angel and messenger. So the reference to the messenger of Allah may be a reference to the enigmatic figure, the angel of the Lord. The Hebrew word Malak has its equivalent in Arabic, Malak, meaning both angel and messenger. But what about Rasul? The Quran itself shows it has both meanings also. So I think the key thing is, does the word Rasul mean the same, like messenger and angel? And if it does, then it's possible that messenger of Allah could mean also angel of God. Okay. And I want to credit Sir Murad for helping me with this one. So Rasul is singular and Ruslan is the plural. Both translations identify that it has that double meaning, angel and messenger. So you can see here that even in the English translation, you have our messenger angels. And down below in the Sahih International, you have messengers here, and it says, i.e. angels. So we're on solid ground in terms of the possibility that Rasul can mean both messenger and angel, the same as you would find it with the word Malak. Okay. So we have three examples of references to the angel of the Lord that I'm going to show you from the Old Testament, and we can see in each case that it is a reference to God. So he said, Hagar, Sarai's maid, where have you come from and where are you going? And she said, I'm fleeing from the presence of my mistress Sarai. Then the angel of the Lord said to her, return to your mistress and submit yourself to her authority. Moreover, the angel of the Lord said to her, I will greatly multiply your descendants so that they will be too many to count. Now, the question is, are we talking about just an angel here, or are we talking about God? Now, if you look at the phrase, I will greatly multiply your descendants, in the context, then you would have to say that angel of the Lord here is referring to God. Okay? So an angel can't multiply Hagar's descendants. It's interesting to note that this messenger of God gives Hagar a promise based on his own authority. He tells her, I will multiply your descendants. Then she called the name of the Lord who spoke to her. You are a God who sees, for she said, have I even remained alive here after seeing him? Therefore the well was called Bir Lahe Roa. Behold, it is between Kadesh and Bered. Hagar recognizes that she's speaking to divinity and is even surprised that she's allowed to live after seeing him. I don't know if you want to come back on that, Jay?
No, and this is really well known in theological circles. Whenever, not always, but most of the time, when you see angel of the Lord right through the Old Testament, it's actually referring to Jesus Christ. It's because only Jesus could be divine. Only if the angel Lord is taking on these characters and these abilities that only God can take, then of course that can't just be a Gabriel or any of the other Michael and any of the other angels. It has to be Jesus Christ himself. This is another example of theophanies in the Old Testament. So this is a classic case. You're bringing up a theophany that is well known within theological circles as referring to Jesus Christ.
Right. I was just going to share with you two other examples just to confirm this concept. So we have this other one from Genesis 22, 11, 12. The next time we see the angel Abraham and Isaac are on their way up Mount Moriah to make a sacrifice. Isaac doesn't know that he is going to be the sacrifice. God asked Abraham to sacrifice his son, and Abraham is heading up the mountain to show his obedience. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham, and he said, Here I am. He said, Do not stretch out your hand against the lad and do nothing to him. For now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. So it's clear there that the angel of the Lord is actually God. So just move on from there. That's the same point. And then if we look at Exodus 3:2, the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a blazing fire from the midst of a bush, and he looked, and behold, the bush was burning with fire, yet the bush was not consumed. So Moses said, I must turn aside now and see this marvelous sight, why the bush is not burned up. When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush, Moses, Moses. Literally, the angel of the Lord appears in all of the crucial texts of interest to the Arabs to do with Hagar, Abraham, and Moses. In each case, the angel of the Lord in the Old Testament is clearly indicated as God. So that's kind of really crucial.
Can I just come back on this? Because it's if you want even more support for that, just open up the Quran yourself into Surah 20, verse 10 to 14, the very same incident. Notice in that incident where Moses goes to the bush, as he approaches the bush, it says very clearly, Moses, take off your shoes, for you're on holy ground. And the question we've always asked whenever we've read this with Muslims, how can there be holy ground without God being there? So the angel in the bush is saying, you're on holy ground. If that's an angel, it would not be holy. Just like it won't be holy for anybody, but only can it be holy where God is there. And then in verse 14, if you have any doubt in the Quran, it even says, the angel says from within the bush, for truly, this is Allah who is speaking to you. How can anybody take on the name Allah except God himself? So obviously the angel that is there, or the fire that doesn't consume itself, is Jesus himself, is God himself, who in a theophany that we call theophany again, another example of that. So it's even in the Quran. And when I bring this up to Muslims, they don't know how to answer that. They usually try to change the subject because that story has been borrowed from the Bible. When you borrow that story, you need to also look at the biblical context. So there's another example in the Quran itself where the angel, or in this case, would be God himself within the bush.
Okay. So therefore the Quran is, I would argue, and as I say, it's a hunch, it's a speculation, but I would argue that the Quran is identifying machmad, i.e. Jesus, with the angel of God. So if you look at the phrase Muhammad, messenger of Allah, if messenger can mean angel as well as just a human messenger, then what we have is we got a reference to Jesus, who's the messenger of Allah, which would mean the angel of God, i.e. Jesus is God. So we have potentially in Surah 48:29 the affirmation that Jesus is God if we accept the potential meaning in the words itself. Obviously, the interpretation would have changed over time, but perhaps in the early stages of the writing of the Quran, that was the original meaning that they had in mind. So the implications of this is that originally the Quranic writers were wrestling with the idea that Jesus is divine. Even while saying that Jesus is a mere warner, the terminology used for machmad is drawn from a tradition that has interpreted differently that he's divine. We saw in the last episode the idea that machmad was able to forgive sins, and that would also support this. So this makes some sense if machmad is Jesus, but no sense if they meant an Arab prophet. Machmad can also be used in the sense of blessed is or blessed be. The interpretation of the angel of the Lord as being God is a dilemma for the Quranic writers, because sometimes the Bible refers to angels as just angels. So they're at pains to say Jesus is but an angel. However, key biblical texts to do with Hagar and Abraham present the angel of the Lord as God. This is a problem for them and requires reinterpretation to avoid this implication. So that's my sort of take on it. I'll come back to you, Jay.
No, excellent, good. Now, again, we're putting this out as a white paper. This is out to see how you people react. Is the references to angel of the Lord, like we see in the Old Testament, which is very clear that it is divine. He takes on and he does things that only God can do and takes on responsibilities that only God can have. Is that the case then when you see it being interpolated and introduced in the Quran? Remember, much of the Quran borrows from biblical text. And when you borrow from the text, you also borrow the meanings with it. Now, later on, of course, Muslims, once they were reading the Quran and once the tafsirs start to be introduced, remember, the tafsirs don't get introduced until Al-Tabari does so in the 10th century. That is 923 is when he dies. So the late 9th, early 10th century is where these interpretations of trying to understand what these scriptures mean, where they interpose then and also always said that these are the angel of the Lord was always an angel. And in this case, they would always say that was Jibril. But if they're borrowing from the text and over again, the original text, the antecedent text, which would be the biblical text, those were always referring to God himself. The angel of the Lord is God. The angel of the Lord was Jesus. Therefore, it stands to reason that these would be references to Jesus. Let's go ahead and put that out there. Let's see how people, Mel, will come back on us on it. And remember, you got the comments right there at the bottom. Go ahead and start commenting. Put down the comments and see how you think whether or not Mel is correct on this. He's going on a limb. This is a white paper, but I'm almost convinced. I'm almost ready to go with you on this. So let's see what others say, and let's see if others are also equally convinced. Thanks so much, Mel. This has been fun. Any last thing you want to say, and where are we going to go next?
Well, what I would say is just be careful what you borrow, because it might come back to haunt you.
I mean, we say this all the time with the story in chapter 2, chapter 7, and chapter 20, where they're borrowing the story of the Garden of Eden. They put that Garden of Eden up in space. Be careful, because in the Garden of Eden, God is in that garden. Therefore, God is face to face with Adam and Eve in the biblical story. When you borrow the story, is Allah in the Garden of Eden with Adam and Eve? If he is so, then God can be face to face with the man. Don't borrow the story without borrowing the meaning. And then, of course, the one I just gave, the example of the burning bush in Surah 20 and also in Surah 27, there you see Moses talking face to face with God, who claims to be God and even makes it holy ground because God's presence is there. We have no problem with that as Christians, because we know God does enter time and space. But if you're going to borrow those stories, borrow the meanings that go with them. If you're going to borrow the angel of the Lord, then you need to borrow also what the angel of the Lord means in its original text. And it always, not in every case, but almost always case, it was always referring to Jesus Christ. So once again, we're finding Jesus in these texts, whether you like it or not. And I know the Muslims are going to have to start agreeing with us. If they do not like it, they'll come kicking and screaming with the acknowledgement that, yes, maybe we're onto something here. Good stuff.
So just one last thing before I finish is that coming up in the next episode, it follows on from this. We're going to actually look at Islamic sources that suggest that Muhammad is divine and has been divine from all ages. That's coming next.
That's even better. Right. Okay. Can't wait. And I'm sure, Mel, the others will want to come on board this. So this is Mel right there and myself, 3,000 miles apart. Over and out.